Welcome everybody to Teaching Black History and Futures Through the School Garden. I am Kimberly Delladonna, the Farm to School Director at Georgia Organics, and I'm so happy to be your moderator for this Georgia Farm to School on Early Care and Education Summit. There's just a couple of housekeeping items to take care of. First is our community commitments, and I'm going to let you know that we look forward to engaging with you, answering your questions, and receiving your feedback. We come from various regions, have diverse and unique perspectives, but collectively we are here for a common cause. We will use this space for positive sharing, to learn from each other, and to gain the knowledge necessary to foster impactful changes in the communities we serve. And then housekeeping, please use headphones if you have them. Please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Those two things will make it a pleasant listening experience for everyone. If you feel comfortable, please turn your video on and engage with the presenters and fellow attendees. Use the Q&A and chat features to the left of your screen on Whova or here in the chat on Zoom to share your thoughts and ask questions. This session is being recorded. It will be available to you later for 6 months through the Whova app. Please be patient as technical issues may arrive, but honestly, I think we've smoothed those out. And then there is a post-session feedback survey on Whova that we would like you to fill out at the end. You just go to Whova and click Rate It under the session. So now it is my pleasure to turn this over to the incredible and amazing Jenna Mobley and Andrea Blanton. I have the pleasure of working with Jenna at Georgia Organics, and I learn from her as she teaches our workshops and models excellent school gardening for all of us. And I am super excited to meet Andrea for the first time and learn from her. So here we go.
All right, y'all, welcome. As Kimberly said, today we are going to be talking about how we can teach Black history and Black futures through school gardens.
So I'm Andrea Blanton. For some reason the screen isn't clicking over to me, but that's okay. So welcome everyone. I want you all to know this is a safe space. We would hope to create that. And many things that I do, I want to make sure that people agree to be here, one, and two, to understand that there's no judgment. There is whatever you get from the session is for you. And I hope that you remain open and honest. And if you have any questions, please feel free to share that in the chat so we can answer them. And if we don't answer them, we'll be happy to follow up with you. So first of all, I want, again, thank you for coming. I want us to kind of do some collective deep breathing. So a lot of times when we're doing healing, indigenous work, we have to come on one accord. So many of us have been in Zooms all day, classes all day, sessions all day. So I would love for us to take a moment, if you can, and if it's safe, to just take a moment and to do some deep breathing together, if you don't mind. And this is something that I do with my children when they come into the classroom or into the gardens. There's so much going on in the hallways. We're transitioning to our spaces. So I want to kind of share that practice with each other. So if you can, please close your eyes. And we're going to take a deep breath in, one, filling our bellies, what I call the infant breath, right? When we watch infants breathe, they fill their bellies up and allow the air to move through their lungs. So we're going to do this about 3 times. So one, put your hand on one of your hands on your heart, one on your belly. Take a deep breath in. Fill your belly as much as possible. Feel your lungs expand. And breathe out. Breathe in, coolness, freshness, new ideas. Breathe out, worry, stress, daily woes. Last breath, breathe in. Breathe out, woes, stresses, and concerns. So I hope we're now here in the space. Another thing that I like to do with our children is all of our homes, our schools, and our gardens sit on sacred land. So before colonialism, before many of our families moved into lands and homes, there were people who lived on these lands and were stewards of the earth, right? We're all in here learning about farm to school, learning how to reconnect students to the earth. And so there is a website I'm sure some of us are familiar with, but it's called native-land.ca. Again, that's native-land.ca. And it allows us, wherever we are in the world, a lot of it has been mapped out for the Western parts of the world of the indigenous cultures that were once on this land. And so in paying respect to those cultures, we are also paying respect to the soil and the stewards of that earth, right? We're teaching our students to take on respective stewardship of the lands. And so if you're in Georgia, predominantly in the Atlanta metro area, we are representing the Muskogee Creek nations. And so we also always want to kind of give a moment of silence to those who have stewarded this earth. So I just ask us to be aware of that, to honor their sacred deeds, to give thanks to the food and the seeds that they left for us and shared with us for our nourishment and for keeping the earth. So, yeah. And let's see what else. Again, thank you for being here. I understand that we're in a monumental season in the Americas and globally, one with the pandemic and two with the flashlight on our history of America, right? And how so many of us want to change that narrative and pay respect to the history of this land. So I thank you all for coming and hope that we all can learn from each other and be present.
Thank you so much, Andrea.
Yeah.
So I thought we could take a look at our agenda and where we're going today. Today, we are going to explore how to relearn some stories about gardening and farming and relearning where a lot of the practices that we do with our kids all the time, where those came from, who we owe that gratitude to. So you can see here on the agenda, we're going to divide this into 3 sections. We'll first start talking about the African origins of our tools in our systems. So that's all about preparing the soil, using garden tools, watering, harvesting, all of that. Then we'll move into a section about the African origins of many of our seeds. And I picked 3 that we'll really focus on for this section. And then looking beyond the school gardens. Of course, school gardens are not the only component of our farm to school programs. We also have school meals, local procurement, pick your own, CSAs, urban farms, and all of those have some incredibly valuable and unique origin stories that are important to teach our children. I will say that this session is not about anti-racist pedagogy. If you were just in Maggie's session, she did a beautiful job talking about how to teach in a way that is inclusive of everyone in your classroom. We don't have time for that in this session, and she did such a beautiful job covering that. In this session, we are uncovering some of the stories that we can carry on to our children that won't happen just in February, not just in Black History Month, but throughout the year and throughout our practices as a normal practice of gratitude.
So our purpose and objective. So intentionally, we want to create the space for honoring those that came before us, right? So throughout the school year, like Jenna said, not just 1 month out of the year, and throughout our school garden activities. And something that I noticed when working with different demographic of students is that I always try to bring in different, their backgrounds, different cultures, different vocabulary. But today we're gonna totally focus on the wisdom of enslaved Africans, stolen predominantly, well, mostly for their agriculture expertise. Many of our forefathers of the America purposely cleared land in order to make sure that the United States of America is agricultural, has an agricultural stronghold in the world. And so today we want to focus on who they had worked the land, and the indigenous wisdom that has been passed on to us.
Right. And it's so important that we do this work because despite the fact that the origin of so much of our agricultural wisdom, despite the fact that that has come from enslaved Africans, many of those stories have been erased. The white voices have been centered, the white heroes have been centered. And if we look around even today, the latest USDA farm census found that 95% of our farmers are white and only 2% of our farmers and growers are Black. And that is a massive decline from even like 1920, we had 14% of our growers were Black. But the discrimination and violence has led to this decline. And so if we think from our children's perspectives, not only are they not hearing stories of people that look like them and where this knowledge has come from, but they may be going to their farmers markets or looking in their storybooks at what a farmer looks like and it doesn't look like them. So I want to take a moment to just think about, as the status quo is right now, when your Black children come into your classroom, how do you think they may see themselves in the story of farming in America? What do you think that brings up for them when they are coming to a gardening, a farming class? We'll take just a few moments to silently reflect on that before we move on. Our hope for you today is that through this presentation, it will start you on a path towards intentionally creating the space to honor those that came before us throughout the school year and throughout garden activities.
Mm-hmm.
So let's take a moment to introduce ourselves as facilitators. We certainly do not have all of the answers, but we'll share what we do know and we'll hopefully ask all the right questions. Andrea, I'd love to hear an introduction from you for everyone to hear.
So hey, some of y'all on this meeting space, I do know, some of y'all do not. Again, I'm honored to be in y'all's presence. So I am the great granddaughter of sharecroppers, both in Mississippi and Louisiana. I come from a line of educators, healthcare workers, farmers, small business owners, by way of Chicago, Illinois. So I'm a city girl at heart, and moved down to the South for Spelman College. And can't leave ever since. From there, I birthed children, found a second career path in farm to school. I was in the inaugural year of Food Corps here in Georgia, and my service site was Captain Planet Foundation, which I was able to serve in both APS, Cobb County, and some of the DeKalb schools. And I started my own business called Food Earth Birth, which is earth-based services for a natural lifestyle. So in that, I offer small food catering, tea ceremonies, herbal education, and doula work, which is intrinsic to many of our lifestyles in the African-American community, just kind of building a whole community. And through that, I have had many hats at community farmers markets. That's where I met Jenna. I've managed 4 of about 6 or 7 markets for community farmers markets. I've been an educational chef. I've done farmer school demos across counties. And yeah, just happy to be here. In response to that question that Jenna posed before we shifted, when I told my grandmother that I was going into garden education, she asked me, why do you want to do that? I picked cotton as a kid and I moved to Chicago to get out of that. So that's just something to sit with. So many of us who is just a generation apart from cotton picking for many of us African Americans in the country. So honored and happy that Jenna asked me to join her today in this discussion. So Jenna, take it away.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Jenna Mobley, and I've been a teacher in Atlanta Public Schools for over a decade. I've also worked throughout our local food system, specifically with the farmers markets and the SNAP and EBT programs there at the farmers markets. And I just want to start by naming that I am a white woman, and what we're going to be discussing is not my history, but this is my work, and this is all of our work. It is work too, because the status quo is what we talked about with the white voices being centered and the white heroes being centered. And that status quo needs to be interrupted. There's a lot of relearning to do. Some of this today will be new information, but some of it will be different information. And I want us all to be able to own who we are and what our role of influence is and our sphere of influence and what we can do to tell these stories that we'll talk about today. I also want to do a quick introduction of this session and the way it came about. In 2018, Peter Morich of Slow Food Atlanta gave me this book. It was an advanced copy of Leah Penniman's book, and it really opened my eyes to many of the stories of farming practices that I had not been taught, that I had never been heard before. And over the past few years, I've been incorporating this into my teaching and researching a little further. So a few months ago when the Farm to School Summit proposals came up, I sort of took a leap and tried to jot down a bunch of the ideas that I had learned about, mostly from this book. And I sent it to Andrea. I knew that Andrea would be the perfect person to put her eyes on this. We've taught alongside each other for so long. And sure enough, somehow we both like dove into this rabbit hole. She was all of the like support and encouragement I needed. But I want to say it out loud that this is our first time presenting this content. So we ask for your grace as we do our best to communicate to you what we have found important. And it's just a starting point. It's a 1 hour starting point. So we're going to miss a lot of parts of the history today. There is so much for us left to learn. So I encourage you all to join us in the chat. Please share your ideas, your thoughts, your questions, what you would like to further explore. I can't guarantee that we will have the answers to your questions, but ask them anyway. Part of the practice here is asking all of the questions and sharing what we want to explore more. And it can't be stated enough. Huge gratitude to Leah Penniman for being the impetus of this project. So let's get rolling here. We're going to start at the beginning of the tools and the systems that we use in the garden. So we will explore the history of preparing soil, using garden tools, watering, and we're going to move through.
Uh-oh. Your volume went out, Jenna. Uh-oh.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. In this first section here, we are going to be exploring the history of preparing the soil, using garden tools, watering, all of that. We're going to move through everything really quickly because we don't have that much time. But I wanted to set the stage here. The very first resource I wanted to share with you is this book about Charles Henry Turner, because like we talked about, our children being able to see themselves as farmers, we also need our students to be able to see themselves as scientists. They need to see scientists that look like them. And this is a book about a groundbreaking entomologist, Charles Henry Turner. And shout out to the Wild Center. I saw it in their most recent newsletter. They have incredible newsletters if you haven't seen it. And this is a book that I've been using at the very beginning of the school year. So when you're planning those beginning August lessons, make sure that all of your students can see themselves in the heroes that you're celebrating and the stories you're telling about scientists. And then shortly after that in the school year, I would bet that you will be preparing your soil for the garden that year. So maybe if you're in kindergarten, you're using your senses to explore the soil. In first grade, you're looking for living and non-living things. Third grade, you're learning about the soil types. All of these different practices that we engage with, this is an opportunity to explore how people have been using their senses and making observations to learn about soil for generations and generations.
All right, so I'm going to preface this by saying we're coming from a point of humanity's start in Africa, right? And so many of these practices have been passed on, traveled through the entire world, right? And so in the book, farmers in Africa have developed intricate processes for testing soils and names for different types of soil. I want to say that language changes, right, throughout times. And so these are the beginnings of how soil was identified. But I also want you to know that it's okay if your students want to create their own words for identifying soil or things that they find in their school garden. So Labu Biri, and please charge it to my head and not my heart. And so in Nigeria, the black soil, which is the most fertile and the most organic matter. And that's something that I think as educators, we do see when we work in a garden, that like that compost that we create is always the blackest and the most beautiful soil. So that's been labeled Lububiri in Nigeria. The white soil, less nutrients due to cultivation and erosion. So that's when we get into like rainwater erosion or just weathering conditions. That's called Lubu Quarry. And then another term for the red soil, red clay that we have a lot of here in Georgia is Lubu Kire, which is red soil. It's less nutrient, but it's due to cultivation or erosion. So a lot of our soils have been over cultivated. Many of us in this region, it's been to over cultivation of cotton. In more southern regions, it's either due to sugarcane or rice. And so those are ways that we can weave into our conversations what was happening in the Americas for this soil to turn out this way. So that's the way that we can bring in social sciences and history. So keep that in mind when you're talking with your students. And so on our next slide, soil testing by color. So the original name of Egypt was Kemet, meaning black land. Many people might identify themselves as Kemetic for African Americans in here in the United States, but referring to the dark soil and fertile soils in the Nile Valley and the Delta. So I do want to express that even though we identify Egypt now as more of like an Arab nation, historically it was on the Black continent of Africa. And Kemet actually stretched not just from Egypt, but all the way down to like Somalia and Kenya. And so that empire stretched pretty much on the eastern coast of Africa. And so when someone references Kemet or the Black land historically, it actually stretches the entire span of Africa. So, and like I said, as we know, compost is the blackest and the most nutrient-dense soil material we use in our current garden spaces. So that science, that technology has kind of spanned across time and traveled across all of our nations and histories. So the Euro people in Nigeria, in the west coast of Africa, many times rub soil between their fingers. And I actually did this lesson with students not too long ago for our late fall COVID safe sessions here in Atlanta at Thomasville Heights. And so we had the students go to different parts of the garden and collect soil samples, and they rolled the soil in their hands to actually express some of the scientific terms that we share with them when identifying soil types. So there was sandy, and then in the Yoruba culture, that's pronounced yanrin. There's lumi, right? So that's aladun. And then the clay type that we're so much more familiar with is bole. So these are ways, I know for our little ones, they're already just trying to learn some of the basic English vocabulary, but it's always fun to try to mix it up. Maybe you can do a scavenger hunt or label different soil types in these other names in order to increase their vocabularies. And we all know how learning different types of language kind of help expand our neurons in our brain. So.
Exactly. So I think that's so interesting to think about how people on the other side of the world have been using their senses and making observations and attaching language to the different soil types like we do now. And one of the questions that might come up is like, well, how do I actually do this in a school garden? Like, what do I actually teach my kids about? And I love that Andrea mentioned, like, this is what she actually does with her kids, is these exact same practices. Yes, you can take your soil test and you can send it away and get all of that data back. But a lot of these practices that have been going on for generations are ones that kids can engage in too. And like Andrea mentioned too, you can create your own language around it. It's interesting to hear what other people have called it, how other people have grouped it. You can make your own based on your own observations. I also, throughout this presentation, have tried to find children's literature connections because I know that's a very accessible way for many teachers to engage with new content. And I thought it was really interesting in this beautiful book called The Secret Garden of George Washington Carver. I thought it was really interesting that there was a section in here too that talks specifically about this same practice. So it says, each day, George rolled the soil between his fingers to make sure it wasn't too wet or too dry. And that was a practice that actually Farmer Fredo talked about in one of our earlier sessions today too. So it's really nice to be able to connect those to people that children can connect with, and in real life and historical figures as well.
hmm So many times, as we know in school districts, we might not have the budget to always have soil testers on hand or pH test strips on hand. Um, and and sometimes we notice some children might be licking their fingers, right? Or secretly tasting the soil. And so actually that's an indigenous practice, right? And so in some parts of the world, soil is categorized by taste. So I did test my students recently to taste the soil to see if they could tell the difference in the different soil samples that they had. The language from Malaysia, that's also a similar language in New Guinea and Northern Australia region. They characterize it by different tastes. So many of us who might do farm to school chef demos or allowing our children to do taste tests, we might categorize it as sweet, also known as ta na peo, or neutral, meaning no flavor, tana tawar, and then sour, meaning it's more acidic, so tana masam. And so these are ways in which we can continuously engage our students on different levels with their taste buds and also with understanding soil science, either through smell or taste.
Yeah. And then as you're preparing your compost, that time of year when you're doing your tumblers or getting your worms out or building these compost bins, there are a lot of connections here too to where compost came from and who the first people were to start building out compost.
And so again, Africa was seen as like dark earth, right? So like dark matter, not just in its inhabitants, but many of the fertile soils of the region. And so compost, as we know, it is dark earth. That's like that. You know, for mothers, we say like breast milk is liquid gold, right? But for dark earth, that's like the liquid gold. And so African dark earth is very dark and fertile. And many people say it's invented by women in Ghana over 700 years ago. So I want to give some cultural context, right? So in our Western societies, the most people who presented in the public are males, right? They went out, they got the jobs, they made sure the country was safe in war. And so with that, the women were left to tend to the lands, tend to the children, and even tend to the markets. And so similar practices in African cultures where the women were deemed to take care of the land and in contingent with their male counterparts. African women invented in Ghana and Liberia over 700 years ago the African dark earth. So it was a combination of ash and char residues from their cooking, from bones and food preparation, and harvest residues. So while men were out hunting, women were back home just making sure that the family ate. So they had leftovers, right? So to me, it was kind of like zero wasting what we had. So this new green term of zero wasting. So there was a high concentration of available calcium and phosphorus, which we need for soil and makes soil alkaline. It stores 200 to 300% more organic carbon than other soils. And elders in the communities in West Africa measure the age of their town by the depth of the Black soil, since every farmer in every generation participated in its creation. So no one was left without touching the soil. And I think this is a beautiful way for us to reconnect and even ask our students like, hey, take a soil sample from where you are and see how deep or how dark your soil matter is.
Yes, I love that personal connection with the soil. And that has been a big takeaway from a lot of what Andrea has shared is, they named their entire land after the soil. That was the most important thing about this land, like where they lived, was the soil. And then here to think about elders in the community being able to measure the age of their town by soil, because soil is the consistent thing. Like this is what they value. I think that connection to soil is something really beautiful. And I love those ideas Andrea gave about how to connect your children to the soil in that same way. You also see, oh, go ahead, Andrea.
No, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to share that we have a lot of other folks besides George Washington Carver to share about, but he happens to be the guy for soil and compost. So we have a little bit more to share about him and another one of his books here. Go ahead, Andrea.
Yeah, so in many of our curriculums in Georgia, George Washington Carver is the guy, right? And so I also want to share that, like, he dedicated his life to agricultural regenerative studies, right? So this is just for the adults, but he actually, so back then, African Americans were not allowed to study to certain levels in upper education. So for him to get his doctorate, he actually had to endure castration in order to study. So I just want people to understand how much he put his life on the line, where he was not even able to have children of his own out of fear that he would engage with his white students. And so he actually he cut off his lifeline, his lifeline, in order to study agriculture in America and to give back to so many communities that he came across. But anyway, so George Washington Carver, he felt like it was morally imperative to care for the soil, and he was the pioneer of regenerative agriculture. So many of us know him through peanuts and sweet potatoes, but George Washington Carver believed that the forest is a natural fertilizer factory, containing trees, grasses, debris that produce countless tons of finest kind of manure, rich in potash, phosphate, nitrogen, and humus. So he used swamp muck, forest leaves, pine straw to fortify the soil. And I want to share an anecdote in my own life. So I have an elder in my life here in Georgia. He grew up south of the airport, and he tells me how when he was a little kid, so he's about 71, when he was a child, his mother would send him out into the forest, like a little bit behind the house, and she would say, pull back the leaves and the twigs, and I want you to get that good soil under there. So he would have to trug pounds of soil back for them to plant up for their summer garden. Like his mother and George Washington Carver, they felt it was morally imperative to care for the soil and get the richest soils to feed their family.
Yeah, this was all about connection. It's to that land, and something that we call dirt sometimes, they're just connected to the soil, and they knew that this is where, like, the source of life was right there in the soil. And some of these ideas are captured in this other book about George Washington Carver. I'll do just a quick little read aloud from a section. And this one is more narrative, as if you are there with Dr. Carver. So it says, Dr. Carver took us to a patch of forest near our school. We scooped up buckets full of rich and leafy loam. While we worked, he explained how rotting plants were full of good things to feed healthy plants. Leaf mulch, swamp muck, and decaying roots will all enrich the soil, he said. You can make your own fertilizer too. I'll leave my recipe for compost. It'll break down quickly and put nutrients back into the soil. So that exact excerpt is in this text from George Washington Carver, about George Washington Carver, and you can see that and read that to your kids to make this information accessible to them. Now we're going to move on to talking about our garden tools. So around the time when you're learning to use these tools safely, maybe you're studying simple machines and the lever and the wedge, and you're preparing to plant, or maybe your kids are working in a digging bed. This is an opportunity to consider who it was that used their knowledge of simple machines and used the resources around them to develop these first tools. I find this so interesting, and I know all of my kids love any of the tools that they get to use. So I think this would be really interesting to our kids as well.
Yeah, I know sometimes as educators, we're trying to figure out, how do we incorporate force and motion, right? Or those physics. And so the predecessors of the trowel included the digging stick, right? So children always on a walk want to grab a stick. And there's some science behind that. So in the past, the digging stick was used to dig out wild tubers to make holes for seeds. Yeah, and I actually see farmers now today just create sticks out of end of broomsticks, large limbs to just pop holes in the ground for seeds. And then came planting knives via couture de couture developed in Cameroon, Gabon, and the Congo. So that was more like Central Africa. And they were leaf-shaped blades. And this was the basis for modern trowels. So planting knives with leaf-shaped blades were developed in Cameroon, Gabon, and the Congo. And here we have different variations of these amazing tools that we use today.
Yeah, it's so interesting to see how they continued to develop. So let's take a look at another one of the tools that we'll sometimes use in our gardens, a garden hoe.
Yeah, so Egyptian farmers began creating hoes about 8,000 years ago. So hoes are used to plow the soil, dig planting holes, heal the soil into mounds, remove weeds, and harvest. And I'm sure you all know that the little ones love to grab a hoe. So it's always best to practice safety in the garden spaces and just share with them, like, Egyptian farmers began 5,000 to 8,000 years ago. So they're actually holding a piece of history in their hands. And still the most used tools in Zambia, Zimbabwe, Uganda, and Senegal, and Burkina Faso. So these same tools are used not only in African countries, but also globally. You can express it in that we use the tools to plow the soil, dig planting holes, heal the earth into mounds, maybe for like potatoes or watermelons. And we also use it to remove weeds and harvest.
Yeah, and I threw in here a little story of someone that lives here in Clarkston. She's very close to my heart. This is Harriet from Burundi, and she is one of the global growers farmers. And I just heard the most hilarious story from her about her garden hoe. And it reminded me that we live in such vibrant, diverse communities. We are surrounded by elders. Andrea was telling some stories of her elders too. And so while a lot of these stories for me came out of this book written by Leah Penniman, ask the people around you and venture out to hear those stories. It's really amazing to hear these stories. The quick version of Harriet and her garden hoe is that she had just come here to Clarkston as a refugee and started to work with global growers. And so global growers provided her with a garden hoe amongst other tools. And she looked at it and was just like, what is this? This isn't a tool. And she would make fun of it, like just like pretend to be using this dinky little tool. She's like, this is not a garden hoe. Like, what, you guys use this here? And it took literally years for us to find the appropriate hoe for her. And it was Rob and Shannon was with her, and they found this little market that I've been to a million times, would have never thought this is where they'd find it. There was this little market over in Decatur, sort of towards Scottsdale, and they had to go into the market and they were asking about it, and they went down into the basement, and in this like bucket in the bottom of the basement was this hoe, like an African hoe, exactly the one she wanted. And you should have seen her light up telling me about this hoe. And she wanted a picture with it. Like, this is her treasured possession. She uses this every single day on the farm and will not even touch one of our like American garden hoes anymore. So that was just such a sweet story of how important tools can be to us, where these tools came from, and just such a good reminder that we are surrounded by elders and diverse stories if we just slow down enough to build those relationships, build that trust, and to listen.
That's pretty cool. So sourcing garden tools, right? So we all know we go to Lowe's, Home Depot, and in recent times, our focus as a community, right, a large national community, has been, where are we spending our monies, right? Where are we sharing our wealth? And so many times we want to make sure that we're sharing our wealth with not just people we are comfortable with, but with people who deserve recognition, deserve respect, and deserve to share in economy building. And so this is a quick story about a father and son. They open a new hardware store in their neighborhood, at Ace Hardware. So I already go to Ace Hardwares because it's like the smaller person in this huge conglomerate of tools and hardwares. So if you're investing in tools, purchase from locally owned, Black-owned businesses. Economic empowerment is key to the overall empowerment of disenfranchised people. So I will share something with y'all. Many times as an African American, I go through my day seeing where the Black-owned businesses are. One, because I know that so many of my dollars going to preserving and uplifting non-Black communities. Why is that important? Because sometimes so I'm getting kind of deep here, and let me know if I'm going too far, but in order to make sure that our communities thrive, many of our dollars have to be shared amongst those who are disenfranchised. And so I ask us to understand, like, when we're buying things, where are we buying our tools? And that's key, especially when we're working in school gardens, and making sure that we are, I guess, creating equity in our spaces.
Yeah, when we talked earlier about considering the influence that you have, originally the context I was giving and what I was thinking about was the influence we have as educators and as leaders in our school or teachers in our school. But also, if you're spending money on your garden program, you have a big opportunity for influence that goes beyond just your school. You have the opportunity to empower disenfranchised people in your community that have small businesses. That's an important reminder of how far those dollars go and the impact you can have.
Yeah. I'm sure we've all heard how much Jeff Bezos has made in the last
Oh my gosh.
2 years. So let's just, think about smaller economies.
Maybe there's some other options.
Yeah.
All right. For the sake of time, I think I'm going to skip us past a couple of these, but all of these stories and information will be available on a PDF presentation. So we also have on here some information about watering practices and the origins of some of our irrigation and our rainwater harvesting, and just a couple of my favorite books about harvest time. I do want to say here that there are so many books about cooking and eating that represent different cultures and cuisines, way more than we could possibly feature here. In fact, we have full workshops. I have a full workshop on choosing culturally relevant books and culturally relevant cooking. So we don't have time to dive real deep into these today, but I do want to take just a moment to voice the message that the children's books that we choose to read to our children and whether or not our children see themselves reflected in them matters. And food is very personal and it's a representation of culture. So the messages that we either intentionally or unintentionally convey to our children about what to eat, how to prepare it, customs around eating, and whether or not they see themselves reflected in that also matters. That was just like a quick PSA as we go through, and an acknowledgement that we cannot possibly cover everything that would go into the cooking and eating, and we're going to focus just on school gardens for right now. So now we're going to quickly go through some of the origins of some of our favorite seeds. I chose 3 different ones that you might be planting coming up, some of the common ones that you might be planting in your school garden for the summer, for over the summer that you would be harvesting in the fall. So maybe you were in my session earlier about planting okra. This October is October Farm to School month, and our featured vegetable is okra. So if you're planting okra and planning on cooking with it and harvesting it, there's a really beautiful story around the origins that is worth exploring where these seeds came from.
Yeah, so real quickly, okra originated in East Africa and Ethiopia. And Leah Penniman tells in her book the story of her ancestral grandmothers braiding okra seeds in their hair before boarding slave ships. And this is a common tale in African American oral history in African American families, where families or enslaved Africans would braid either legumes or vegetable seeds in their hair because they were not sure what was on the other side of this treacherous journey. And so the name for okra in the central Bantu dialect of West Africa is Ki Ngombo. So that sounds very familiar to one of our favorite dishes in the South, which is gumbo. So when you say gumbo, it actually is the actual West African term of Ki Ngombo.
Yeah, one of the other things you might be planting this summer is peas, and I call them cowpeas here because it's familiar to me, but it's the same thing as southern pea or field peas, or black-eyed peas is maybe what you recognize in this picture. That's something that you also might be planting over the summer since it grows so quickly and will suppress all the weeds, and it'll fix the nitrogen into the soil, some of the things that George Washington Carver was studying. And it has a unique story of coming to this country as well.
So cowpeas originated in Central and South Africa. And it's an important crop because it's tolerant to sandy soil and low rainfall. So ideal for us in the South. And like Jenna said, it fixes nitrogen from the atmosphere into the soil. And it was considered a common table food in Virginia after the American Revolution. And it's been used to feed livestock here in America, thus hence the name cowpea. And it's a popular dish for New Year's Eve to ward off bad energy in African homes. So it's kind of like the eye of luck, or to ward off the eye of bad energy. That's where we get black-eyed peas.
I love that. Yeah, these are pictures I took at the Truly Living Well Garden here in Atlanta of yams or sweet potatoes. This is another one of our favorites to grow over the summer.
Yeah, and so I had a really great experience with an after-school program in Cobb County, um, and they planted before the end of the year, right? Like a few weeks before the end of the school year. We came back over the summer, like October-ish, and harvested our sweet potatoes and made sweet potato pies for Thanksgiving, which was an awesome experience. So yams, it comes from West Africa, the word yam, which means to eat. Um, and as a noun, it means food. So in many indigenous cultures across the globe, the yam is like the staple, included in Africa due to its nutritional value and its ability to grow without much tending.
So George
And I think that's, oh, sorry. I think it's a great crop for teachers who are like, I don't want to go outside all the time. Like I've come across teachers like that. Like I got so much to do, but I think it's a really fun activity and it yields amazing produce if you just leave it, pretty much. Just wanted to put that in.
And tell the story of it. There's a rich history that has an important context there of how that came to the Americas as well. And of course, another George Washington Carver connection. I won't read this whole excerpt that I pulled out, but I think this, one of the quotes from this book really set the stage well for the impact that his work had. It said that when Carver first arrived in Alabama, he said everything looked hungry. The land, the cotton, the cattle, the people, farmers were in trouble. The cotton crops were destroying their land. And so he experimented with these new crops to replace cotton, like sweet potatoes and beans. It had the nutrients to nourish and refresh the soil. So when you're growing any of those, there's another great connection there. Now, I also threw this in sort of last minute. If you're growing an herb garden, maybe you're growing calendula and you're gonna harvest it and put it in some water in a little spray bottle for your algae spray, anything you're doing in an herb garden, there's an important story about Harriet Tubman. Does anyone know this story before I flip the page? All right, I see some shaking heads. Yeah, Harriet Tubman has a strong connection to herbalism.
Yeah, so of course, as many enslaved Africans, they were their remedies were on the land. A lot of it was passed down, and Harriet Tubman used remedies from her grandmother to treat fugitive slaves, keep their babies quiet on the Underground Railroad, and heal soldiers in the Union during the Civil War. So enslaved herbalists fought to keep their traditions at great cost. Slave owners so feared being poisoned by the people they enslaved that herbal practices were banned altogether. And the crazy thing about that, sometimes the enslaved Africans were called upon when the doctor was not around. Many of us might heard of like nanny midwives in history, and a lot of our gynecological and nurse midwifery practice that are used, that was the foundation of the American gynecology and obstetrics practices, was also based on the works of these herbal, I guess, new age term of folk medicine, so to speak.
Yeah.
And her powers were amazing. One, to free those who were enslaved, and two, to be able to just kind of, as we call now, foraging, right? So like it's a cool term to say, oh, I forage this and that. And many of the enslaved Africans, that's what they had to do to survive and make sure that their health was in high standing to be able to continue to work such arduous days. on plantations.
Yeah, incredible wisdom. So I'm going to skip past a couple of these as well, but just to say out loud, again, when you're buying seeds, this is another opportunity to consider where you're sourcing from. So I gave one example here of Southern Exposure Seed Exchange and some quick looks at some of the farmers that grow those seeds for Southern Exposure, which are really beautiful for kids to connect to as well. So that the seeds didn't just appear in your school garden classroom, but we were intentional about where we purchased them from and who we're supporting when we do that. And they were seeds grown by real humans that we can support and hear the stories of.
Mm-hmm. So now we're going to go beyond the school garden, right? So like we've planted, we've harvested, and now what does that mean for our nutritional department and the knowledge that our children can take home with them?
Yeah, so you may know, but school meals that our kids eat every single day, maybe even more often than they visit the school garden, started with the Black Panther Party and their free breakfast for school children program. This was just one of the many programs that they did, but what's important is that it helped contribute to the federal meals programs that we have now. And that story of where those came from and the activism it took and who it was that made that happen for these kids is a story that many of our children don't know, that can be a part of their understanding and their gratitude for the service that they now have and how it came to them.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to add real quick, there's a film on HBO called Judas and the Black Messiah where you can see where the Black Panther Party was labeled as a Black terrorist group. However, you can see where some of these school meals, breakfast meals, meals for families was actually integrated into the Chicago community, which is where I'm from. So you can actually see it on the screen. So another thing we have to think about is local procurement, right? And many of us who may be in the nutrition department at our schools on a district level, we might say, well, there's just not that many diverse farmers to grab from, right? However, in 1980, in North Carolina, Philip and Dorothy Barker started Operation Spring Plant, and they provided aggregation, processing, packaging, grading, marketing to 10 farmers in a 50-mile radius and sold to schools, grocery stores, hotels, and community members. And there are other organizations in the Southeast who also do similar work. I want to say it's the Federation of Southern Cooperatives who also offer up amazing information on connecting with different farmers in the Southeast. So besides that, much like Georgia Organics, this group here, they supported Black farmers in transitioning from conventional tobacco growing to organic food production. So like my family, right? So like we were sharecroppers of cotton. Many times, Black farmers were pigeonholed into certain crops, so like monoculture, and we all know that it's not good for the ecosystem. But farmers such as the Barkers were instrumental in making sure they shifted that and created a space for Black farmers to get more into organic food production for their communities.
Yeah. Also, if you have been to any field trips, if you've been to any pick your own operations, if you've gotten any CSAs at your school, those were all the brainchild of Booker T. Watley. And in addition, if you live somewhere like Atlanta, like where I do, if you're around urban farms, there are some incredible people doing urban farm work right now. I don't know if anyone recognizes this guy here in the left corner. He's sort of famous these days. That's Ron Finley. And then this is one of my favorite books about farmer Will Allen. And I love this quote from the book. It really sums up why urban gardens are so important. He'd see that fresh vegetables were as scarce in the city as trout in the desert. Will believed everyone everywhere had a right to good food. It's such a great example for our kids to hear about and look up to from some children's literature.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite books. I share that with my students in our summer camp program.
Good. Yeah,
So,
go ahead, Andrea.
No, you're good.
I was just going to say that we're getting close to the end. I wanted to save a little time here at the end to make sure that we went through some very tangible things that you can do in your program, some important things to think about. I know that there was a lot of information, about 50 slides worth of information to be exact. And Farming While Black is a 200-page book, and that's only a start. I know that there is so much, and I know that it's really new and different than a lot of what we've already been doing. So I wanted to invite you to engage in just these top 4 things as you continue on into your work. And that is to uplift the voices and the stories of Black communities, both in the past and in the present. And remembering that one of our purposes here in gathering today is recognizing that white voices and white heroes have been centered over and over again. And so it is our work to interrupt that and to give a platform to some of these other voices and those stories, and to celebrate the contributions of Black scientists, farmers, and activists, not just in Black History Month, but all year round with all of your activities, so that your children can see themselves represented in the farmers and the scientists and the activists that you're talking about in your classroom, that you're seeing in your children's books. So that's the third one here, is to do an audit of your children's books that you use in the school garden, and recognize if your children in your class are going to see themselves reflected in it, if that book is going to be like a mirror where they see themselves and their identities validated, or if that book will be more like a window where they will have a window into someone else's perspective. And how can you create a balance in both for all of your students with your children's literature? And as Andrea mentioned before, think about where you're spending your money, because garden programs spend money season to season, year to year. Gloves, trowels, seeds, compost. Think about where that's going and the impact you can have on your community when you spend that money with Black-owned businesses. Is there anything else, Andrea, that I missed on this list? Some takeaways?
You know, and for some of us, you know, I think my year at Food Corps and my short certification through Habesha, I realized, like, sometimes you don't have the funds, right? There are people on campus who have the answers to your questions. And it's okay to ask and be like, how do you use this? How do you use collard greens? Can you show me how to prepare these black eyed peas? I had a janitor, we just call him Mr. K, because no one could pronounce his last name, but he was actually Vietnamese. He was his last year, he's about to retire. And he showed me where he planted so much okra and how he prepared his okra dish, because in Clayton County, we had a mix of Black and Vietnamese students. And so I just want to share, like, sometimes you might not know where to Google or hashtag search. Ask the people in your own communities for assistance through these processes, because we're all connected to the soil. To me, it's like our soul. So like SOUL, the soil is our soul. And so you have resources at your fingertips in so many different ways.
Absolutely. I love that, of just like ask, listen, read, learn. Because as we said at the very beginning of this presentation, if we are just using the information that comes to us, if we are just using what the ad dollars put in front of us, if we're just using what the textbooks put in front of us, we are
we're in for it.
We're reinforcing the status quo, and the system will continue. Yeah. So this takes going beyond what the ad dollars put in front of you, what the textbooks put in front of you, and asking and listening and relearning and reading and finding out more from the people around you and the resources available to you, so we can do things differently. And so the makeup of farmers in our community can look different, so the children in our classroom can feel different. That's what we're going for here. Thank you so much to everyone that joined us today. Again, this is just a starting point. It's just the start of some stories that we'd love to have told in more classrooms across our state and across our country. I put both of our Instagram handles on here. I think that's the best way to get in touch with both me and Andrea. And these are conversations that we want to continue. We do not necessarily have the answers to any questions you might have, but please ask the questions and let's talk about it and listen and learn from each other's elders and experiences and figure out how we can do things a little differently. The last thing I'll say here is that I did link some of my sources here on the last slide. When you get the PDF, you'll be able to click on those and learn more. Keep asking and listening and learning, and let's do things a little differently. Let's make sure all of our students can see themselves represented in the work that we're doing in our school gardens. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, y'all.
Wow, that was fantastic, Jenna and Andrea. Thank you so much. On behalf of the Georgia Farm to School Alliance, the Georgia Farm to ECE Coalition, Georgia Organics, and the planning committee for this summit. We really appreciate you sharing your wisdom and your experience, and the resources here have been tremendous. So we can all access this information, this session on Whova for the next 6 months if you'd like to rewatch it. And then definitely check out both Andrea's and Jenna's Instagram because they're beautiful. And there's much, much more there, more buried treasure. So thanks again for joining
the
us.
Chat too. I just saw some great suggestions in the chat. Make sure you guys see that before we log off.
Also, cherish books. Let me put cherish
excellent.
books.
Yes, for Black-owned businesses. Yeah. I saw Nicole Lupo had mentioned Ace Hardware in Decatur, Tony Power.
Love them.
Fantastic store. And then Black-owned bookstores. One local Black-owned children's bookstore in Georgia is Young, Gifted, and Black Children's Books. Fantastic. Brave and Kind Books and the Listening
Decatur.
Decatur. Go Decatur.
Decatur, that's where I live. Decatur, where is greater?
Awesome. Well, please go back to the Whova site and rate this session and continue to enjoy the summit. We really appreciate y'all coming today. And thanks again, Andrea and Jenna.
Thanks so much.
I want to add one last thing. It's really an act of resistance that any of you are sitting in this session. Like, we've been so trained to go, like what Jenna said, with the status quo, like from all of our education, right? And I think when as they say, when more than one gathers, what is it? God is in the presence or something like that. But like, it stretches. This is getting to Afrofuturisms, where like we're crossing again timelines and healing our own family lines by being in this session and listening and hopefully applying some things that we picked up today. So sorry, Kimberly.
Thank you, Andrea. It has been so cool having everyone in this group.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the summit.